Hi, and welcome to this very special Impetus interview. My name is Chris Stiles, and today I'm joined by Professor Jacob Sherson, who is a professor within the Department of Physics and Management at Aarhus University, and is also the founder and the director of the Center for the Hybrid Intelligence and the game-based citizen science platform, ScienceAtHome. Thank you very much for joining us today, Jacob.
Thank you.
So a lot of your work at Aarhus is very multifaceted with your work. Obviously, you are within the Department of Physics, but also within the Department of Management, and also the work you do with the Center for Hybrid Intelligence and the citizen science work you do. You have a very broad kind of remit a little bit. So I was just wondering if you describe how you got to this point in your career, I suppose.
Yeah. So I am originally a quantum physicist. That has always been sort of my main interest, but I've also had many other areas of interest along the side. And as I sort of matured as a researcher, I at some point decided that I would like to create simulation tools that made it more accessible for all of my colleagues to be simulating their own kinds of complex physics. And at a point in that stage, it suddenly occurred to us that these kinds of simulations very much looked like games. And we thought, okay, why don't we try to take one of our complex quantum challenges, turn it into the form of a game, and then pose it to the general public to see whether their general intuition could be used for helping us solve these problems. And we launched a game called Quantum Moves. It was played by 300,000 people. And we really got sort of a lot of insight, both into the physics, but also into how you could take this citizen science approach and engage the general public in not just physics challenges, but then from there, it really broadened out to say that other natural sciences, but also social science research challenges that we started to gamify and try to bring out to the general public.
It's really interesting that you use the word simulation, just because that seems to be just a way of recontextualizing, I suppose, quite complicated information and concepts and reforming it into a way that's a little bit more easily to understand. And quite a lot of your work seems to be kind of the celebration of these complex kind of issues, but distilling them into something that can be understandable, like the mystique behind quantum physics. It's kind of like the go-to kind of black box sort of idea, but the work that you do really seems to bring out kind of the gears and the bare bones of it, I suppose. And yeah, I suppose.
Yes, and so one thing is that you can say there's so much going on in every kind of workflow as a researcher or in every job. There's so much going on that sort of is happening intuitively or without being very explicit. And this is what we're trying to tap into. Also, when we have AI as an assistant or as a mirror, then we can really try to create tools that enables people to sort of dig out that kind of intuition that they were employing all the time, but more in a more systematic and explicit way.
Do you think having your varied background working within management and physics and then with the citizen science work, does that help you develop kind of a mindset to help communicate these? You're not in your silo of pure quantum physics, you're in kind of multifaceted, transdisciplinary kind of. Do you think that sort of mindset has helped kind of portray these different concepts in different ways that maybe people who are pure quantum physics maybe don't see, perhaps?
Yes, I think that's since I have so many, you can say, interdisciplinary collaborators, then our language is already at a lower, you can say, degree of complexity of technicalities, and so we are used to, even as we develop these games and these efforts, to talk to try to reach that common understanding. And then, of course, developing the games is a process in itself. I've sometimes reflected that maybe the person who is learning the most or changed the most from all of these efforts is myself, because it really is an exciting challenge to be able to take something which is mathematically complex and then pose it as something that is much more accessible, and it forces you to think more accessibly and talk more accessibly also.
I suppose, yeah, you talk a little bit about this gamification or kind of changing, creating these interactive kind of hands-on experiences. I've got two-part questions really. So, have you always been into games? Is it something that kind of can draw this kind of passion for problem solving and gaming into the work you do, or is that kind of an evolution of kind of your work, like your career path, I suppose? It just seemed to be the way forward.
Yeah, for me personally, so as a young person, I played games, but then as an academic, I really had no time for that, and so games was really just the natural evolution of a means to an end to say, okay, we really want to reach the general public, we really want to broaden the scope out, and game is just a really accessible tool. So I was not an expert at creating games. I've never coded games myself, sort of in my early career. But really, when the need was there, I had to align myself with experts within game design and try to learn as much as I could from those experts.
So I suppose that's just another facet of the broad team that you work with, I suppose. Could you talk a little bit about the process of making one of these games? Does it involve, obviously you have to work with the scientists, you work with the game developers, but do you have like people from different sectors, different like the general public like testing that your game is, sorry to sound a bit forward, but to make sure the game is fun before you put it out into the world and yeah, that sort of thing.
Yes, exactly. And first of all, they are not necessarily very fun the first time they come out, and we do go through various different iterations of the games. And the other thing is that I've had a lot of discussions with my game development team also that I had to tell them when I hired them, you are not going to create an Angry Birds game that your co-developers, so your colleagues in the game development world, are going to be really, really impressed by, because we on a research grants, we simply don't have the budget to create something which is Angry Birds like or Candy Crush like. It is really a question of, rather than creating a game that is competitive in its own right in terms of the game mechanics, then it's creating a narrative of how the people who are participating in these games, they are participating in what we call a game with a purpose. And so they're not wasting their time. And that means that sometimes even a fairly basic mechanic can be very meaningful and engaging if you at the same time communicate very efficiently that this is accumulating data. This is a direct line to the researchers and to the data scientists. Every time you play this and you move your mouse here, data flows into our database and we're going to be analyzing it. And we are just a little bit step closer to understanding these kinds of processes.
Could you talk a little bit about what sort of citizen science have you been able to gamify? What sort of inputs have you been able to allow the general gamer, the person on the other end of the smartphone or something like that, to contribute to, I suppose?
Yes, yeah. So we started out on the natural science side and the quantum physics side, where we had a challenge related to being able to build a quantum computer. And so in a step of the quantum computer, you had to pick up an atom with a tweezer of light. So it's a very strongly focused light beam, and then you had to move it. And when you move that atom in its own little trapping environment, then it actually is very reminiscent to water, which is sloshing in a cup. And that became the analogy that we sort of gamified around there. Then we've also taken a game around turbulence, for instance, and so there is what is called a Millennium Math Challenge in turbulence, that we really don't understand how the energy in turbulent flow, which is what you have when you have smoke rings, and how that dissipates is not understood. And so we gamified having simulations of turbulence, and then having citizen scientists go into those simulations, dive into them, and then analyze what do these small turbulent flows look like, and sort of mark those. And then we have moved, we have done in computer science games around, there's something called NP hard problems. So really, really hard combinatorial problems, which we try to illustrate in a visual way so that people can maybe get a little bit of an intuition for how to find shortcuts for solving that. And then we have a whole range of games that are more in the social sciences, where we have a game called Skill Lab, where we have gamified a number of cognitive profiling tasks. And our mission was then to have as many people playing these gamified cognitive profiling tasks as possible, which sounds like a data nightmare, but it's exactly what Facebook and Google are doing. And we wanted to be sort of an open source alternative to that, to discover some of the secrets that these big tech companies are discovering, but then bringing it out open source, not bringing the data out open source so that it can be exploited, but bringing the insights out open source so that you could imagine that we could make a, let's call it a Facebook filter or something like that, that says, or a little friend that says, you are now being manipulated. Are you okay with that? And those kinds of insights are really not accessible to anyone but the big tech companies. So that's an illustration how we can gamify. And if we can get lots of people to do that, we had 20,000 Danes who played those games in a sort of a national effort. And we really could see sort of new insights then in that database of cognitive profiles. Another thing that's interesting about that game, I think, is that cognitive profiles is very prevalent, but only for half of the world population, and that is the men. And that's because when they go to a draft in the nations where there's a draft, then you have a sort of an IQ test. And then there's lots and lots of studies where you'd say, okay, these IQ tests, and then correlations with all kinds of world behavior. But it's a real democratic problem that that kind of research is not available on half of the world population, the female population. So it's about sort of democratizing that part.
No, that's really interesting. I suppose, yeah, as you say, it's a way of sort of collecting data, but also making sure that just reminds you of a book, Invisible Women, where there's lots of data points that are just missing because they just haven't been looked at or they haven't been collected. And this sort of tool is helping to level the playing field a little bit, perhaps.
Yes, exactly. We have another game that's called Urbanizer, which I thought was really cool, about having sort of micro societies that are exchanging resources. And then it's very well known that we people, when we interact, so me and you, when we interact, then we hate inequality. We really would not want equality to be arising between the two of us. And still, when we have a society at large, then inequality arises always. And the fundamental mechanism of why that happens, if we all hate inequality, why does it arise, is really not very, very well understood. And so we try to make a citizen science game called Urbanizer, where you could then, in a small mini society, exchange goods. And then we also had people who were a little bit more rich than others. And then we asked the question, or we could, on data science, ask questions: did people trade more with the people who were rich? And thereby get insights about that kind of dynamics of how inequalities arise in societies.
Oh, that's fantastic. It reminds me a little bit of, like, I'm a zoologist by training, but you do like these studies where you give monkeys one grape versus one piece of apple, and they can see the inequalities there and that sort of thing. It seems really interesting. So it seems to, with these gamifications and these approaches to citizen science, definitely has its strength in the social sciences. I do have a slight question about, because you've been working quite a lot with AI, and we'll talk about some of the projects that you've been doing with AI a little later on. Going back to sort of the quantum physics of it all and kind of the more mechanically, or basic, not basic, that's not the word. Fundamental is probably a better word than basic. What are the benefits of having citizens do these these kind of micro calculations rather than running them through an AI? Is there a don't get me wrong, there's obviously science communication benefits and better science literacy, so there's that side of it. But from your researcher purely side of it, would it not be just worth running it through a big data AI system or something like that?
Yes, and that is a valid question, and that's something that we have been investigating over a decade now, and really trying to say, okay, how do these challenges compare if you are running them against the state-of-the-art optimization algorithm? And what we see is that it's not actually, so after the sort of the end of the analysis, what we come to realize, or what I personally came to realize, was that really it was not a man versus machine, and are the humans more intuition, and can the human intuition overpower the sort of the brute force approaches of AI and other sort of algorithmics. It's really a question of what I call hyper intelligence, of can we understand enough of the kind of interconnections that you could make between the human intuition and then the algorithmics that would make the system as a whole more powerful. And that's what we were exploring in our findings, was really to show, what if we allowed players to sort of start by trying to solve this solution, then and then we give the first attempt of the players to the computer, and then the computer sort of just fine adjusts everything, because motorically it is not possible for us to repeatedly try things out, and it's not possible for us to have that fine adjustment that is necessary to get 99.99% sort of accuracy on everything. But it's more about those big picture ideas of how do you do the first attempt if you are in a landscape of things that can be done in millions or trillions of different sort of first ideas, and then some of these first attempts, even if you optimize them as much as you want, they sort of never lead to anything foundational. And what we're studying there is then, how could we then tie the loop back to the researchers and ask the question, how do you actually initialize your algorithms? What kind of prior information do you feed into it? And could we have a discussion about maybe making the intuition that you as a researcher were doing more explicit, and try to formalize that and say, well, let's call it human intuition and classical sloshing of liquids, and how could that become a powerful tool in the toolbox also of the researchers? So it's one part is about solving the challenge, but more importantly, it's about finding out a language of how we could in the future tap into these strengths more efficiently.
Oh, so that's fascinating. It's so, just from my understanding, it's a little bit like, as humans, we're very good at sort of understanding what a task might need, but maybe not very good at getting to the very end point. We would, like, humans in these systems are doing whereas as an AI might not know at all what to do at the beginning, so might just do random movements until it gets a slight success, and then from there keep doing random things until it gets a slightly more success. Whereas a human would say, oh, we need to follow this tunnel around until we get to this chamber, and then there's a problem in this chamber that we can't solve.
Yes.
It's finessing the kind of the beginning parts of the problem solving, I suppose.
Exactly, and tapping into all of the multidimensional processing that we humans do, because we have experience, we know the context around a challenge, and so we just assume that we know what to do first, whereas the algorithm sort of has to guess the rules of the game, and that guessing the rules of the game at random can sometimes take a long time, and we can short circuit maybe that trial and error period by really tying that loop. And that's also what we're seeing across the AI training mechanisms that are happening today, and the GPT's revolution that is happening today. It really only happened due to the systematic involvement of humans in the training of the loop there, to sort of short circuit that conceptualization of human intuition and get that embedded a little bit in, and then it can run its magic after that.
So I suppose this runs quite nicely into my next kind of talking point, I suppose. Obviously, a lot of the work you do is using like these hybrid systems and these AIs, but obviously AI is now on the top of everyone's kind of the tip of everyone's lips a little bit, with the challenges and opportunities that the AI obviously is going to provide. But you also describe yourself as a techno-optimist. So I'm just wondering how you've used AI in your research, or I don't know, the challenges and opportunities you see with that, but perhaps from maybe not the doom and gloom that lots of people might think of these systems, I suppose.
Yes. So there's been a lot of debate around AI technologies being a threat to democracy and being a threat to humanity. And what we try to do with this hybrid intelligence approach is to discover and to communicate some light points around that, or some some things that can give hope, or some examples that can give hope, in the sense of saying that that combination of human and AI can be very, very powerful and can really rethink all of our processes. And that's what we're trying to do in what we call AI-driven participatory democracy project that we have, which is called CREA Visions, where one of the big dilemmas in modern democracy is, how do we get more and more people engaged in discussions around value-based dilemmas that are happening at societal scale? That could be the SDGs, and how do we solve them? Global warming, how do we solve them? How do we prioritize resources to do these kinds of things? And how do we create a vision about the kind of society that we want to have, which is not about numbers, which is not necessarily about science. Science can be the solution of where we want to go, but science cannot necessarily tell us what kind of a society we want to create. For that, we really need to tap into the minds of the collective and say, what are we collectively dreaming about? And that's what we're trying to do in the CREA Visions project, where we use generative AI, text to image. So that means that we have a small mini game created on top of the generative AI technologies, where you can type something and then you can get an image of the corresponding image, the concept. And we have then worked over various different iterations with various different municipalities, for instance, in Paris, in Venice, Belgrade, and in Aarhus here, where we work with the municipality to create a setting in which the general public can create images and some text around it that communicates both the challenges that they see right now and in the future, but also the solutions that they see.
No, I've read up a little about the CREA Visions project, and it seemed it's a very interesting, fascinating kind of way of, I don't know, recontextualizing and bringing people into the conversation about what they want to see in their futures versus the utopias versus the dystopias a little bit, and using that as a jumping off point for, again, it might seem like talking about dystopias and utopias are very kind of binary kind of things, but I suppose in the world that we're living in right now, perhaps kind of some drastic talk is kind of needed to get policy change done, I suppose, a little bit.
Well, yeah. So when we talked, for instance, to the Aarhus municipality, they had defined what they call 7 wicked problems, 7 wicked challenges for the municipality, inspired by the SDGs, but in a local context. And it turns out that they are really heavily prioritizing each of these 7 dilemmas, but they had no idea what the general public thought about each one of them. And so we created this game, and then we reached out to the general public. We had some thousands of people from the municipality, citizens, who engaged with the game and then created these visions. And then they tagged them also along those 7 wicked problems, which means we are now going back to the working groups of these 7 problems, saying, here are some input that are specifically around each of these challenges. And that could be city integration, for instance. It could be youth mental health. And then we actually have hundreds of students down to the 2nd grade who are reflecting on, what does mental health mean to me, and how can I visualize that, make pictures around it. We've created art exhibitions around this, so that, again, the general public and also the policymakers can come and really experience that sort of wall of images, of thousands of images and captions that were created, and that becomes a new discussion and meeting point for that.
This might be a bit of a weird philosophical question, I suppose. So do forgive me if it's a little bit off the wall. When people were kind of creating their utopias, was there a general trend that did you see? Lots of greenery, lots of waterways and that sort of thing? Or was there a little bit like, actually, my version of utopia is this techno-futurist kind of, I don't know, what was the general kind of perception of what utopia is?
That was also a very interesting discussion point back into. So we went into the classrooms, for instance, we created these tasks for them and said, okay, create a vision. And then it was a very interesting discussion point when we said, okay, the first 5 submissions that you made has lots of greenery and no humans, and it has no living spaces. And then there was a 2nd round of reflection of saying, oh, okay, yeah, that's actually true. How do we create a future in which humans and nature can both thrive? And so in the loop, it creates some reflection also about what is our perception of the ideal futures that we can have. that I thought was really engaging and interesting coming out of that.
With the CREA Vision project, you work quite closely with the United Nations group AI for Good. I'm just wondering, obviously, having such a thing in existence is A, necessary now, and B, probably quite prudent. But I'm just wondering how they contributed and the work that they do towards like what what is their what do they do exactly?
Yeah,
And
so
yeah.
so this is a very broad effort around various different uses of AI that can be in very contextualized situations. And what we talked to them about was to say, okay, can we create something which can be a digital platform or a digital meeting place? And so that was actually the very first version of CREA Visions that we created and we conceptualized together with them to say that this could be that visual space. And this was back in 2020 when image creation technologies were not by far not as advanced as they were today. So that thing that we can now go in and say, I would like to have a mountain and a castle on the top, and I would like it to be raining, did not exist at that time. So it was really a question of how could we work with existing technology, how could we push existing technology, and how could we create a frame and a narrative around it so that it became a socially engaging activity rather than just sort of a part-time activity of making funny faces.
Mm-hmm.
And that was that experiment together with AI for Good to see, can we create that seed of something that becomes a public platform? Concretely, it was launched with a podcast series by the AI for Good people, and it was pushed in their network. So that particular iteration in 2020 was really launched on a global scale in a sort of an exploratory manner. And we had maybe around 1,000 people who joined. And it gave us lots of, we explicitly mentioned this as saying this is the first step of a very, very long journey of trying to get feedback and to see what kind of sensible questions can we be asking to the general public and how can we frame that.
No, that's really interesting. And obviously, as you say, like even 3, 4 years ago, AI was not in anywhere close to where it is now. And it's
And so what we actually had to do in subsequent versions, and in the first version, we actually took a landscape AI, and so that means many of the lands, maybe where there were no buildings explicitly, but you could sort of build them there. But then for subsequent versions, before the generative AI revolution that we've experienced this year and last year, we actually went to Paris, we went to Venice, and we took lots of physical pictures, and we trained our own AI, and we did that. And so there was a lot of hard technical work. And then for the latest version in Aarhus, what we did was we got lots of images from the city archives, and then we just uploaded them. And now in the current version, you just log into the game, you say, which of all of those Aarhus scenery pictures do you want? It is loaded in, and then with generative AI, you just say add flowers, and then the flowers are just added. So that's also another point of citizen science and AI, is that has become much, much more accessible to create something, even without a very expensive development unit now. And that's why I'm techno-optimist, because I think that we are now discovering the infinity of possibilities of engaging with human creativity and on an individual scale and on a collective scale that are enabled by, but not taken over by, AI.
No, that's really interesting what you say, just because there's been obviously there's quite a big kind of divide in public perception of AI and these emerging technologies.
Mm-hmm.
The image creator you used seems to be built from a photo library, so it's slightly different from the generative AI that like some artists have been kind of crying out about with kind of plagiarism of their art styles and that sort of thing. But it's just as we move into the future, it seems very important that we stay ahead of any controversies. So keeping up with the ethics and that sort of thing, and groups like yourself working with these technologies, but also such as AI for Good, are there to kind of make sure that we don't have blinkers on for kind of how we use this technology, I suppose.
Yeah. So no one has the answer at the moment to what kind of an impact AI is going to have. I have been asked about regulation. My opinion about regulation is we don't even know what to regulate. We wouldn't even know how to regulate it very efficiently because we don't know exactly how the AI is going to be implemented into our workflows and into our society. So what we need to do is that we need to be experimenting, and we need to be experimenting with positive narratives of how this technology could be used. We are also going to see failures. We are also going to see financial mini collapses and events that are that are going to be hurtful. But those are the kind of learning curves that we have to go through in this sort of very accelerated pace before we can really start to see and sense what is it that the future society with AI is going to look like. And my sort of driving point is that there are so many instances where we see technology like AI coming out, and where it seems as if it is taking all of our job roles. But then when we start to integrate it, then it turns out that the journalist plus the AI was capable of writing something completely different than they had before, or providing services to. So we're seeing newspapers on the very, very low scale of sort of micro societies or villages, and new services that are appearing, and new kinds of ways of interacting with AI that I think are going to be the way that we are going to be empowered by AI and not just taken over by AI. But we need to be experimenting with this, and that's what my group and others are trying to do at the moment.
I suppose that feeds back into the techno-optimist sort of side of it. You could be all doom and gloom, or you could see the opportunities of it's going to be a co-learning experience, it seems, I suppose. We're going to be doing research on AI, but also using AI as a tool for making research and science more accessible and easier to do, I suppose. So
and sort of very, very sort of briefly put, the way that I view it is that we are going to be using AI. We're going to see AI as a mirror and as an empowerment tool to discover what I would call the infinities within us, and that there are so many ways in which we could be augmented, that I think we can do really wonderful things on an individual scale. Our democracy can be a really thriving and wonderful democracy, but it doesn't come easy, and we're going to have to fight for it.
I suppose you do seem to just have a very optimistic kind of frame of mind, I suppose, and that kind of leads quite nicely to my last question. I was watching your TEDx video about becoming a quantum physicist in 5 minutes, and you open with a very interesting story, and I know that kind of it's a little bit like knowing how the magic trick's done. It doesn't. The truth of the matter is, it doesn't particularly matter. But I don't know. You predict that you're in a field full of clovers, and you predict that the next one you pick up will be a four-leaf one, and you claim that it is. And I would like to know the truth, but I kind of know that that's not the point of that story a little bit. So I just wanted to kind of I just love that little that
and
aspect
the
of it.
point of the story is actually that we cannot know, and I can never tell you whether it was the truth, but I can say that to me it was the truth. Did my subconscious see that four-leaf clover and said, "Oh, I'm going to play a trick on Jacob himself and his sisters, and then I'm going to say this thing"? That is very possible. So in that sense, it was not truthful that I just at completely random picked something up. But I wanted to use it as an illustration of all the wonderful things that are happening in our minds, that if we can start to harness those, and if we can start to understand those things, being human can really be a fantastic thing in the coming decades and centuries.
I think that's a very good way of, unless there's anything else that we've missed that you'd like to just include at the moment, I think that's a very nice way to end this conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm happy.